Hello, everybody. Hi, everybody. How's it going? Good to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom HaMishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Thursday? Bella in Florida, Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Shandora in the Bronx, Renee in Indiana, Belle in Texas, Randy in Florida, Bill in mid-Missouri, Karen in Northern California, Yehudit in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Ilanit in Silver Spring, Marie in Freeport, New York. And it's still daytime here, but tonight we reach Lag BeOmer, Lamed Gimel, the 30. We just counted 32. I'm not going to say the next number because you don't want to count prematurely. But today's the 32nd day, and so tonight when we count will be the next number, and that's the day on which the celebrations begin. I can shave. And that's the day we celebrate that the students of Rabbi Akiva, the plague ended, and we start kind of really zoning in those last 16 days headed toward Shevuos. Right, we'll be about 2/3 of the way through our journey from the second night of Passover to Shevuos. Let's get into it. Our daf today, we're doing a single page. Just 2 minutes. It was a little too long to do a double, but we'll be able to do a double tomorrow with God's help. So our daf is page 6. We're picking this up about halfway down, a little less than halfway down on page 5b. We're still discussing Mishnah number 1 here in Tractate Shevuos, the 26th volume of the Talmud. And this was this kind of odd first discussion in the tractate about oaths, when one swears before God that what he's saying is true, including it could be a pledge to do an action, or that he has done, or that he will not do an action, or that he has not done an action. And because there are two listed in the Torah that become 4 categories, even though it's not explicitly written in the Torah, it's considered a Torah law, that the 2 become 4. And then we're discussing other areas of the law where the same structure, that 2 provisions in the Torah actually imply 4 provisions. And we've been looking at one who is tameh, ritually impure, when he enters the holy temple, when it's standing in Jerusalem, or who eats sacrificial foods while he's tameh, or one, and he did in a lapse of awareness. He didn't realize that he was tameh. or he knew he was tameh, but he didn't realize he was eating sacrificial foods, or that he was standing in the temple. Then there's the case of 2 becomes 4 of carrying out on Shabbos, transferring an item from a private domain to a public domain, or vice versa. And today we're going to look at that third category listed in our Mishnah, which has to do with marks that indicate tzaraas. Right, so when we don't have this condition anymore, physical expression of a spiritual malady, but in ancient Israel, when the whole nation was a higher level, this was a kind of a contagion, so to speak, real problem if it happens to you, but it's actually a spiritual opportunity to make a teshuvah, to make an atonement for the behavior that led to one having tzaraas. Now, physically, what it meant is that you would have these white markings or different kinds of markings on the skin, and then an expert in tzaraas, who is a Kohen, would have to come and look at the marks. It's funny, I was at the dermatologist yesterday, and I was thinking, how did my dermatologist learn which marks, could be dangerous and which marks are not? I happen to be a person with freckles and delicate skin and susceptible to dry weather and allergies. So like my skin, just color-wise, like very irregular. I have all kinds of markings on my skin. And I go to the dermatologist once every 6 months to have him look me over and make sure that none of these markings, could portend something that could be a problem that would have to be removed. Now, the subtlety of the markings when it comes to tzaraas, a lot of nuance, as we'll discuss today. So it really struck me. I mean, we're going to talk about this in great detail, but how could, even a great rabbi really learn from these words what these markings really look like? And if tzaraas hasn't existed in thousands of years, maybe it will come back with the coming of Mashiach, but we'll really, the Kohanim who are going to be charged with declaring that someone has tzaraas or not, I think are going to have to be trained by, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, or an angel, or somebody coming back from the dead. Perhaps when the resurrection of the dead, Kohanim who had this expertise will come and teach modern Kohanim what this looks like. Because just from words, it's hard to imagine that somebody could learn, without some kind of perhaps supernatural gift of understanding visually what these things look like. This will become more clear as we get into it. Okay, so about halfway down on page 5b. The Mishnah, our Mishnah here on page 2, the first Mishnah of tractate Shevuos, taught, with regard to different shades of leprous marks. Leprous is how it's translated here in the Koran. It's not leprosy, not what we understand by leprosy. So that's why I always say tzaraas. With regard to different shades of tzaraas, there are 2 types that are actually 4. And we learn in a Mishnah there in Tractate Negayim, with regard to different shades of marks of tzaraas, there are 2 types that are actually 4. The baheres mentioned in the Torah, Leviticus 13:2. This is considered a primary mark. It is an intense white, like snow. And secondary to it, meaning a subcategory of the baheres, is a mark that is white like the lime plaster of the sanctuary walls. Some kind of off-white. Very warm in here. The Mishnah continues. The seis mentioned in the Torah is considered a primary mark. It is white like wool. Wool, much less, right, pure white. Secondary to it is a mark that is white like the membrane of an egg. I feel like the membranes of eggs are probably more consistent white color than wool. I mean, wool? Maybe there's only kind of one type of sheep that was present in ancient Israel, and they all had very similar wool, but I would think there'd be a lot of variations in wool. Now, the ordering of the different shades is relevant in determining which shades can be combined together. In order for a mark of tzaraas to be halakhically significant, right, meaning that the person is going to be quarantined to inspect it later, or actually declared tameh with tzaraas, the marks have to be of a certain size. But sometimes 2 marks that are separate marks, or maybe barely linked marks, they could combine to produce one of the minimum size so that the person could be declared a mitzora. So the ordering is relevant in determining which shades can be combined together. In order for a mark of tzaraas to be halakhically significant, it must at least be the size of a split Cilician bean, known as a baheres. So if a mark is that size, but it is composed of different shades of white, none of which is alone the size of a baheres, then if the different shades are compatible, they can combine together and will thereby render the person tameh. Rabbi Hanina said, who is the Tana who taught this Mishna, which delineates the different shades of marks of tzaraas into two groups? This is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. As if it were in accordance with the Rabbi Akiva, this would present a difficulty, since with regard to which shades can combine together, Rabbi Akiva says the different shades should be ordered, this one above this one and that one above that one, according to their degrees of brightness, from the most bright to the darkest shade, as follows: snow white, the baheres; wool white, the seis; lime, and then egg membrane, right? Four shades of white in order of the purest white to the least pure white, let's say, to the most off-white. And only, according to Rabbi Akiva, two adjacent shades can combine together. But if so, you have rendered pure a mark that is white like the lime plaster of the sanctuary walls and is smaller than a baheres, as it cannot be combined with any other shade of white. And the Gemara explains, with which other shade could we combine the lime-colored mark? We cannot say, let us combine it together with a snow white baheres, which is the primary mark relative to a lime-colored mark, as there is a wool white seis, which is a more bright white than the lime-colored mark, but less bright white than snow white. Since baheres is not adjacent to lime, it cannot combine with it. We cannot say, let us combine it together with a seis, as a lime-colored mark is not its secondary mark and a primary mark. The issue here is, according to Rabbi Akiva, there's just four shades. And we can rank them from most white to most off-white. And then any two that are adjacent to each other, if you find two marks like that of adjacent colored whites, then the Kohen could say those two combine to create the minimum size mark of tzaraas. That's Akiva's system. But the system we're learning here is that there's actually two that become four, meaning that there's two primary categories, the baheres and the seis, and then each one of those has a secondary mark. And the secondary mark of a baheres cannot combine with the seis. So since Akiva has ordered them in such a way where it would need to combine with the ones that are adjacent also happen to belong to different categories, we're not going to be able to make this combination. So maybe that's why we don't follow Rabbi Akiva. Right, so the Gemara explains, with which other shade, that is why we cannot combine. So the Gemara asks, if that is so, that Rabbi Akiva holds that only adjacent shades of white can combine together, why didn't Rabbi Hanina also bring proof from a mark that is white like the membrane of an egg? As with which other shade could we combine it? We cannot say, let us combine it together with a wool white seis, which is a primary mark relative to the egg membrane colored mark, as there is the lime colored mark, which is a more bright white than the egg membrane. Again, the same problem. If we're using the system of two primary kinds of white and two subsidiary whites, and we're going to mix it with the adjacent whites scheme, it won't mix together and produce the result that we need as a legal system. Since the seis is not adjacent to the egg membrane, it cannot combine with it. We cannot say, let us combine it together with the lime-colored mark, as it's not its type, the subsidiary concept, and they are not of the same category, so they cannot combine. Now we're on page 6a. The Gemara answers, what is this comparison? Granted, it would all be well were it not for the difficulty with regard to a mark the color of the lime plaster of the sanctuary walls, as the difficulty raised with regard to an egg membrane colored mark is not difficult, as even though the shade of an egg membrane is 2 stages below that of a seis, the merciful one states, and for a seis and for a sapachat, from Leviticus 14:56, which indicates that this sapachat is secondary to a seis and can combine with it, even though a sapachat is of a much lower degree of brightness than it. So Rabbi Akiva holds that both of the additional shades not explicitly mentioned in the Torah are derived from the word sapachat. And so both of them can combine with the seis. But the difficulty raised with regard to the mark, the color of the lime plaster of the sanctuary walls, is indeed difficult. Rather, it is clear that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Now, the Gemara elaborates on Rabbi Akiva's opinion that we can only imagine with our imagination what we mean by these shades of white, but this is the opinion that we don't follow anyway, but we still have to learn it. So the Gemara elaborates on Rabbi Akiva's opinion. And where have we learned that according to Rabbi Akiva, the different shades should be ordered, this one above that one, in order of decreasing whiteness? So if we say we learned it from that which is taught in the following Baraisa, it is difficult. The Baraisa taught, Rabbi Yosef said that Yehoshua, the son of Rabbi Akiva, asked of Rabbi Akiva, for what reason did the sages say that the different shades of tzaraas, marks, are two types that are four, and proceed to specify their names? Why did they say that? And Rabbi Akiva said to him, to his son, but if not that, what else could they say? And Rabbi Yehoshua answered him, let them say that any mark of a degree of brightness from that of an egg membrane and above is ritually impure, is tameh, indicates tzaraas. Rabbi Akiva said to him, they specified the four different shades in order to say that they combine with each other in that order, i.e. each one with its adjacent shade. Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, if so, let them simply say any mark of a degree of brightness from that of an egg membrane and above is tameh, and they combine with each other. Rabbi Akiva said to him, they specified their names in order to tell you, any priest who is not an expert in distinguishing between them and in identifying their names is not authorized to inspect the marks of tzaraas and make a decision regarding them. Good logic, good wisdom there. You certainly wouldn't want somebody who's not a top expert in something that is so nuanced and difficult to be making a determination. Now, interesting, only a Kohen can make a determination. So what if there is no Kohen in your region who can make this determination, but there is a rabbi? Could the rabbi come and say to the Kohen, yes, this is tzaraas, yet no, that is not, and then the Kohen makes the determination? Put a hold on that question. The Gemara explains the difficulty. Rabbi Yehoshua suggested that according to Rabbi Akiva's opinion, it should be sufficient to say that any mark of a degree of brightness from that of an egg membrane and upward is tameh, but he did not say that it would also be necessary to add, and any mark of a degree of brightness from that of the lime plaster of the sanctuary walls and above is tameh. If Rabbi Akiva agrees to the categorization of the Mishnah, then it would be necessary to state separately each category of marks in a dual formulation in order to indicate that only shades that are categorized together can combine, two marks that are too small, but if they're the right shades, they could be combined together to say this person has tzaraas. The Gemara suggests, conclude from the fact that he did not say this to Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Yehoshua heard of Rabbi Akiva, that he says, wait a minute, let me read that again. Conclude from the fact that he did not say this to Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Yehoshua heard of Rabbi Akiva, that he says, all the different shades combined with a seis. So accordingly, both the snow white baheres and the lime-colored mark will each combine with a seis, as they are adjacent to it when listed in order of their degrees of brightness. And an egg membrane colored mark will also combine with a seis, as it is derived from the word sapachat. And the Torah indicates that a sapachat is secondary to a seis. Now the Gemara rejects this proof, but perhaps Rabbi Akiva does hold that the only combinations possible are a seis and its secondary mark, i.e. the egg membrane colored mark, and the baheres and its secondary mark, i.e. the lime colored mark. And perhaps Rabbi Yehoshua in fact proposed that the sages should use a dual formulation, but the Baraisa cites only the first half of his suggestion. So rather, Rabbi Akiva's opinion can be inferred from that which Rabbi Hanina says, as Rabbi Hanina says, the following is an analogy to illustrate the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Great. If your head is swimming with this, this might make it a little easier to follow. To what is this matter comparable? It is comparable to 4 cups of milk. Okay, 4 cups of milk, all the same shade of white. And 2 drops of blood fell into one of them, and 4 drops of blood fell into the next one, and 8 drops of blood fell into the next one, and 12 drops of blood fell into the last one. These drops of blood will obviously make the white a little bit off-white, right, in a reddish direction. Maybe the last one will start to look a little bit like my skin, right? White that has become a little bit reddish. Still off-white, basically white. If you saw it by itself, you'd think it was white. But alongside a cup of milk that had less of this coloring blood dripped into it, you could tell which one is whiter than the next. Now, this is a suitable analogy, as the milk in all of the cups still has a similar shade of white, but the cups can be ordered according to their degrees of brightness, as this one is above this one and that one is above that one. So Rabbi Hanina's analogy would appear to portray Rabbi Akiva's opinion in the same way it was cited earlier. Interesting, they're saying it's basically the same shade of white, but these little, a few drops of blood, different amounts, different numbers of drops of blood falling into each one would render them less bright. We don't talk about off-white, we talk about less bright white. But that's the idea. Now, the Gemara rejects this whole analogy. The Torah states that a reddish white affliction, not just a flawless white one, renders a person tameh. Therefore, the Gemara suggests, say that you heard Rabbi Akiva express this opinion with regard to combining different shades of a mark that is mixed with red, befatuch, which is the case most similar to the analogy offered by Rabbi Hanina, but with regard to different shades of flawless white. Have you heard Rabbi Akiva express this opinion? And if so, and if you would say that just as you heard Rabbi Akiva express this opinion with regard to a mark that is mixed with red, so too, by logical extension, you have effectively heard Rabbi Akiva express this opinion with regard to a different shade of flawless white. As what possible reason is there to differentiate between them? This is difficult, and this suggestion is problematic, as in the case of mixed reddish white mark itself. Did you ever hear him express this opinion? But isn't it taught otherwise in a Mishna? With regard to the various shades of white that are mixed with red, Rabbi Akiva says the reddish variation of this one, i.e. the baheres, and of that one, meaning the lime-colored mark, are like wine diluted in water, except for the following distinction, that the reddish variation of baheres is still an intense white, like snow, albeit with some pinkish hue, but the reddish variation of lime is darker than it. Now we're on page 6b. And if it is so that Rabbi Akiva lists the different shades in decreasing order of their degree of brightness, then, after mentioning the reddish variation of baheres, he should have said the reddish variation of a wool white mark is darker than it, not that the reddish variation of lime is darker than it. So they said in response to this, yes, indeed it is so, that Rabbi Akiva continues by referring to the reddish variations of a wool white mark, and it is taught likewise in the Baraisa that Rabbi Nassan says, referring to that Mishnah, it is not correct that Rabbi Akiva said the reddish variation of lime is darker than it. Rather, he said that the reddish variation of a wool white mark is darker than it. Now, the Gemara considers the source from which the different shades of marks are derived. And from where do we derive that a baheres is an intense white color? Abaye said the verse states, and if it is a white baheres, Leviticus 13:4, which indicates that it alone is a bright white, and there is no other as white as it. And the sages taught in Baraisa, the bright shade of a baheres makes it appear deeper than the surrounding skin. And so the verse states, and its appearance is deeper than the skin. And this is like the appearance of an area illuminated by the sun, which appears deeper than the area in the shade. The darker shade of a seis makes it appear as though it is raised above the surrounding skin, and this is indicated by the fact that the word seis means nothing other than raised. And so the verse states, upon all the high mountains and upon all the raised up hanisaot hills, right? Same root from Isaiah 2:14. So the words hanisaot and seis share the same Hebrew root and both refer to something raised up. In the verse, for a seis and for a sapachat, the word sapachat, I should have been saying sapachas if I'm going to be Ashkenaz. The word sapachas means nothing other than secondary. And so the verse states, and he will say, append me, sefacheni, please to one of the priestly classes to eat a piece of bread in 1 Samuel 2:36. And this teaches that there is a mark of tzaraas that is secondary and appended to the seis, the subcategory of seis. This is the mark that is the color of an egg membrane. Now we found the source for a mark that is secondary to a seis. From where do we derive that there is also a mark that is secondary to a baheres? So Rabbi Zera said white is stated with regard to a seis, and white is stated with regard to a baheres in Leviticus 13:10 and Leviticus 13:4. Now this teaches that just as the shade of white with regard to a seis has a secondary mark, i.e. the mark that is the color of an egg membrane, so too the shade of white stated with regard to a baheres has a secondary mark, and this is the lime-colored mark. A different source for this was taught in a baraisa. The verse in Leviticus 13:2 placed the word sapachas between seis and baheres to say to you, just as there is a shade that is secondary to seis, so too there is a shade that is secondary to baheres. The Mishna in Negayim, cited above, states a seis is like white wool. And the Gemara asks, what is meant by white wool? Okay, that was my question earlier. Rav Bevai says, that Rav Asi says, it is the color of clean wool from a lamb that is wrapped up in a cover when it is 1 day old in order to protect it from being sullied. So the wool will be suitable for producing a white wool garment. I guess some lambs are white wool, right? They're born very white, maybe like the way kids are often blonde, even if they're going to have darker hair later. I don't know anything. People from a farm can let me know. Are many lambs born like very white? Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow. Is that what we're talking about? In the continuation of his statement cited above, Rabbi Hanina says, the following is an analogy to illustrate the opinion of the rabbis, i.e. the opinion expressed in the Mishnah in Negayim, that both a baheres and a seis have marks that are secondary to them. So to what is this matter comparable? To 2 kings and to 2 governors, eparche, where, with regard to their supremacy, the king of this governor is above the king of that governor, and the governor of this king is above the governor of that king. The 2 kings are analogous to a baheres and a seis, and their 2 governors are, respectively, a lime-colored mark and an egg membrane-colored mark. A nice analogy. You could get 2 on top, right? 2 that are subordinate. And the 2 that are subordinate, the 2 on top can be compared with each other, and the 2 on the bottom can be compared with each other. They're also different from each other, but they're grouped so that one is subordinate to, the governor is subordinate to his king, and this governor is subordinate to his king. So accordingly, the order of supremacy is baheres, seis, right? So baheres, seis, and then presumably the lime-colored mark and the egg membrane. Is the egg membrane secondary to the seis? Think so? Okay. Right, so the Gemara questions whether this is a suitable analogy for the opinion of the rabbis. But this analogy suggests that the shades are ordered, this one above this one and that one above that one, i.e. according to their degrees of brightness. That is Rabbi Akiva's opinion, not the opinion of the rabbis. Rather, a better analogy is where the king of this governor is above his own governor, and the king of that governor is above his own governor. So too, each secondary mark is subordinate only to its primary mark, king and governor, and we don't compare this governor to that governor or that king to that king. The Gemara presents a different analogy, right? We're trying to have analogies, kings and governors, to help us understand how these white marks are grouped, and the analogy became too complicated, and it's not helping us anymore. So we're going to try a different analogy. Rav Ada bar Abba said, for example, a king and a chief officer, the vizier and the exilarch. Do you know how to order those? I got that the king is on top. How do we compare a chief officer, a vizier, and an exilarch? The exilarch is the head of the Jewish community in Babylonia. He's like the king of the Jews, but he's subordinate to the Persian king, presumably subordinate to the vizier, presumably subordinate to this chief officer. How do the chief officer and the vizier compare to each other? I guess the chief officer is above the vizier since he was listed before the vizier, but let's see. The Gemara asks, but this analogy suggests that the shades are ordered, right? From most white to least white, 4 in a row. That's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. I thought we were trying to get to the 2 pairs. Rather, a more suitable analogy is like this. A king and the vizier, a chief officer and the exilarch. This list splits the 4 into 2 groups, each group containing one person who is subordinate to the other. Now, the Gemara presents a different analogy. Rava said the previous suggestion is not precise because all these positions, apart from the king, are subordinate to the king. A more precise analogy would be, for example, King Shapur, the king of Persia, with his subordinate, and the Roman emperor with his subordinate. These kings are separate. We can say that one of these kings, one of these emperors is more powerful than the other, but we can, surely everything kept separate, right? So the king, the Persian king, let's say in the exilarch, or the Roman king and a regional governor, those are 2 separate systems. Rav Papa said to Rava, which of them is greater, King Shapur or the Roman emperor? Right? We're digressing again to start examining the analogy. The analogy was supposed to make it clearer for us how these white marks compare to each other. But now they're getting curious about the analogy. So which of them is greater, King Shapur or the Roman emperor? Rava said to him, does he eat in the forest? About him, right? Rava said about Rav Papa, does he eat in the forest? Do you eat in the forest? Meaning, do you live disconnected and unaware of events in the real world? You don't know who's more powerful, King Shapur or the Roman emperor? Go out and see whose coin circulates throughout the world, which is an indicator of a government's influence. As it is written with regard to the 4th empire described in Daniel's dream of the future powers of the world in Daniel 7:23, it shall devour the whole earth and tread upon it and break it into pieces. And Rabbi Yochanan says, this is the guilty empire of Rome, whose coin circulates throughout the entire world. Right? So how do you tell the measure of power of an empire, of a nation, etc.? How much of its currency is used around the world? So by that measure, the American dollar, which is probably the most widely used currency in the world, would indicate that America is the most powerful country in the world. I'm sure many people could argue, but I think many people would agree with that. And based on this definition, it makes sense. Will it always be so? Was it always so for Rome? No, it was not. Right? Once you get to the top, be careful. The Gemara presents a different analogy. Ravina said, for example, a new white woolen garment and a frayed one, frayed, F-R-A-Y-E-D, a new linen sheet and a frayed one. What are we talking about? The Mishna on page 2a states, in cases of defiling the temple or its sacrificial foods, in which one had awareness at the beginning and awareness at the end, but he had a lapse of awareness in between while he actually transgressed, right? He was in Jerusalem for one of the festivals. He attended a funeral in the morning. He became Tameh. He forgot that he was Tameh. He entered the temple. Later, when he left the temple, he remembered, oh my gosh, I was Tameh when I went in there. So through a lapse of awareness, he committed an unwitting, right, unintentional transgression of this prohibition. He's going to become liable to bring a sin offering. Which sin offering? The variable offering, depending on his personal level of wealth, would determine which kind of animal he would bring as that offering. Okay, we've seen that law a few times. Now, what about it? The sages taught in a baraisa. From where is it derived that the verse that describes the liability for a sliding scale offering, Leviticus 5 verses 2 through 4, speaks of nothing other than the defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods. While the verse mentions that a violation was committed due to a lapse of awareness of one's state of tuma, of impurity, it does not mention which transgression was violated. So this idea that you rendered something, that you were, while in a state of impurity, touched something that you shouldn't have touched, and therefore you become liable, some kind of holiness, and therefore you become liable to bring this offering. Okay, we get it. But why are we going to apply this to stepping in the temple while tameh, or eating sacrificial foods while tameh? Why not apply it to eating some other kind of consecrated item like teruma? So the Gemara explains, and it is a logical inference. Since the Torah has explicitly prohibited and also prescribed punishment, right? So we see this pair almost always have to go together. The Torah will, in different places, different verses, do two things. Say that an action is prohibited, that's the prohibition, and state that there is a consequence for violating that prohibition, right? That's prescribing punishment. Okay, so those are two separate things. The prohibition and the punishment. They occur separately in the Torah. So since the Torah has explicitly prohibited and punished for the intentional defiling of something sacred, and has rendered one liable to bring an offering for the unwitting defiling of something sacred, it follows that just as when it is prohibited, that just as when it, the Torah, prohibited and punished for the defiling of something sacred, it prohibited and punished only for the intentional defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods, so too, when it rendered one liable to bring an offering for defiling something sacred, it will render one liable to do so only for the unwitting defiling of the temple or its sacrificial foods. In other words, it's stated explicitly with regard to other types of sacred things. So we're going to extend the two parts, to prohibit and punish, and to distinguish between intentional and unintentional, which we see with regard to other sacred items. We're going to extend the same structure of law to defiling the sacred by entering the temple while tameh, or eating sacrificial foods while tameh. Now the Gemara asks, but why? I'm sorry. The Gemara asks, but say instead that the obligation to bring the sliding scale sin offering is referring to a ritually impure person, a person who's tameh, who partook of the sacred portion of produce grown in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, that is designated to be given to a priest, i.e. teruma, right? The first 2% of the produce that has to be given to a priest. So now the priest has to eat it while he is tahor, ritually pure, and the teruma itself has to be ritually pure, tahor. First of all, there's a different transgression if a non-priest eats it. If a non-priest eats it and he is tameh, maybe he's guilty of two transgressions. So are we talking about a non-priest, or are we talking about a priest who is tameh when he eats the teruma? Let's read carefully. But say instead that the obligation to bring the sliding scale sin offering is referring to a person who's tameh, who partook of teruma, as the Torah also has explicitly prohibited and punished for this. One who partakes of teruma while tameh is liable to receive death at the hand of heaven, karas. Now the Gemara answers, now that's not high of misa, right? It's not death at the hands of the earthly court. It's excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court, if you do it intentionally. So the Gemara answers, it cannot be referring to teruma, because we do not find a sin whose punishment is misa, meaning death at the hands of an earthly court, with regard to which one is liable to bring an offering for its unwitting violation. Sin offerings, of which the sliding scale offering is one type, are brought only for transgressions whose intentional violation is punishable by karas, and if you did it unwittingly, you bring a sin offering. If there's something that is punishable by misa, the death penalty at the hands of the earthly court, if you did it unintentionally, you don't bring a sin offering for that. The sin offering doesn't apply in that situation. Now the Gemara asks, but say that this statement applies only to a fixed sin offering. but one can bring the sliding scale sin offering for the unwitting violation of a transgression whose intentional violation is not punishable by kares, but rather by misa, just as is the violation for hearing the voice in Leviticus 5:1. What is this? This is where a litigant asks a witness to testify about an event, and he takes a false oath that he did not witness the event, and for taking a false oath with the utterance of the lips. In both of these cases, an intentional violation is not punishable by kares, and nevertheless, one is liable to bring a sliding scale offering for an unwitting violation. We are on page 7a now. The Gemara answers, it cannot be referring to one who partakes of teruma while ritually impure, while tameh, as the verse concerning the sliding scale offering states, quote, or if he will touch impurity of a man in any manner of his impurity, through which he can become impure. So the verse through which is to exclude an impure person who partakes of teruma from liability to bring the sliding scale offering. And the Gemara asks, but say that the verse states through which in order to exclude one who defiles the temple, and teach that due to the severity of that transgression, it is not sufficient for him to achieve atonement with a sliding scale offering. Rather, he will not achieve atonement until he brings the fixed sin offering. Accordingly, no proof can be drawn from there. Rav has said the following verse about Rebbe. One who draws water from deep wells, meaning a big compliment to Rebbe, who was able to figure out this law from very difficult, subtle verses. This verse describes Rebbe because by delving deeply into the Bible, he found a source that the sliding scale offering atones for the unwitting defiling of sacrificial foods by partaking of them while tameh. And this is as it is taught in a baraisa concerning the verse, or if a person will have touched an impure object, whether the carcass of an impure animal or the carcass of an impure domesticated animal. So Rebbe says, since a domesticated animal is also referred to chaya, it would be sufficient if I would read only the verse's clause about a chaya. Why then is an explicit clause about a behema mentioned? This is undomesticated animal versus domesticated animal, chaya versus behema. It is in order to derive a verbal analogy. It is stated in the verse here, an impure domesticated animal. Now, remember that we're talking about a kosher animal. So because a non-kosher animal is not going to be impure. Only kosher animals can become impure. If it's a domesticated animal, it's known as a behema, like a cow, or a goat, or a sheep. If it's an undomesticated kosher animal, like a deer, venison, that is a kosher animal if it's slaughtered in a kosher manner, but that's known as a chaya. So it is stated in the verse there, an impure domesticated animal, and it is stated in the verse below with regard to one who intentionally defiles an offering by partaking of it while he is impure, an impure domesticated animal. And just as below the reference is to the defiling of sacrificial foods, so too here the reference is to the defiling of sacrificial foods. Now the Gemara continues, we found a source for the law that the sliding scale offering atones for the defiling of sacrificial foods. Right? That's what we were looking for. That's what our Mishna is based on. That if you are tameh and you unwittingly defile either the temple itself by entering there or sacrificial foods by eating them, you would be liable to bring this sin offering. And likewise, if you didn't know you were tameh, but you knew you were in the temple or eating a sacrificial food. And likewise, the two becomes four, that if you knew you were tameh, but you didn't realize you were standing in the temple, or you didn't realize you were eating sacrificial food, you would also be liable to bring this sin offering if that happened during your lapse of awareness. So now we have derived that if during this lapse of awareness you forgot you were tameh and you ate sacrificial foods, you owe the sliding scale offering. We have not yet derived that this would also apply to one who enters the temple while tameh and not aware of that. So what's going to happen? From where do we derive that the defiling of the temple also renders one ritually impure? The verse states with regard to a woman after childbirth who is tameh due to having given birth. She may not touch any sacred item and she may not enter the temple. So the verse juxtaposes the temple to sacred items to teach that the laws that apply to one apply to the other. It's very interesting. A law that's going to now apply to Kohanim is derived from the law of the mom who just gave birth. And so accordingly, the sliding scale offering atones for both. And the Gemara asks, if so, that the liability to bring a sliding scale offering is derived from this verse, then one should also be liable to bring the offering if he partakes of teruma while tameh. As the master said that the general term sacred item in the verse, she may not touch any sacred item, serves to include teruma in the prohibition. Accordingly, it should also be included in the obligation to bring the sliding scale offering. So the Gemara explains the merciful one excludes something using the term through which. Leviticus 5:3. Should we say that the term through which serves to exclude the defiling of the temple? No, it is reasonable that we should not exclude the defiling of the temple, as its intentional violation is punishable by tzaraas, just like one who defiles sacrificial foods by partaking of them while he is impure. So rather, the term must serve to exclude one who partakes of teruma while impure. That's the one that's not like the other two, but defiling sacrificial foods or defiling the temple by entering it while you're tameh, those go together because they have similar penalties associated with them. The Gemara offers a counter argument. On the contrary, we should not exclude one who partakes of teruma while impure, as it is a violation done through eating, similar to one who eats sacrificial foods while impure. That they have more in common with each other because they're both acts of eating than they have in common with one who enters the temple while tameh. Therefore, there is still no proof that one is liable to bring a sliding scale offering for defiling the temple. So rather, Rava said it can be derived from the following. Why does the Torah mention 3 times the punishment of tzaraas with regard to one who partakes of peace offerings while he is impure? The 3 times are in Leviticus 22:3, 7:20, and 7:21. One time is to apply the punishment to the general case of a ritually impure person who partakes of any type of offering, and one time is to apply to the specific instance of a peace offering. And one time is to apply it to another case of defiling something sacred that is written in the Torah without specifying what it is referring to. And I do not know from that passage what that case is. So Rava continues, the only passage that describes the defiling of something sacred without specifying the situation is the passage in the Torah that discusses a sliding scale offering brought for the defiling of sacrificial foods. Therefore, you must say that the 3rd mention of tzaraas is referring to the defiling of sacrificial foods. But if it is not needed to teach the matter of defiling sacrificial foods, as that has already been derived through the verbal analogy of Rebbe, apply it to the matter of defiling the temple. Accordingly, one who intentionally defiles the temple by entering it while impure, while tameh, is liable to receive tzaraas, and it is reasonable that he should be liable to bring a sliding scale offering if he does so unwittingly. Tzaraas if he did it intentionally, sliding scale sin offering if he does it unwittingly. The Gemara asks, but that 3rd mention is necessary in order to expound it in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Abahu. As Rabbi Abahu says, why does the Torah mention 3 times the punishment of tzaraas with regard to one who partakes of peace offerings while he is tameh? One time is to apply the punishment to the general case of an impure person who partakes of any type of offering. One time to apply to the specific instance of the peace offering, and, here we differ, one time to apply it to the tameh person who eats items that are not generally eaten, like frankincense. It's edible, but is not generally eaten. The Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Shimon, who says that for items that are not generally eaten, one is not liable to be punished with tzaraas for partaking of them while he is tameh. So then the 3rd mention is necessary in order to include the case of a tameh person who eats an internal sin offering. What's the internal sin offering? This refers to a sin offering that is not offered on the external altar, nor is its blood presented there. Rather, its blood is presented in the sanctuary, and then its flesh, instead of being offered on the altar, is entirely burnt outside the temple. That's what's an internal offering. So let's get back to this. For any type of offering, as it could enter your mind to say that since Rabbi Shimon says, for any type of offering that is not sacrificed on and its blood applied to the external altar in the manner that peace offerings are, one cannot be liable to be punished with tzaraas for eating it if it is pigul. Pigul means that at the time that the Kohanim made the sacrifice, they had a faulty intention. They made a mistake about timing, and they were planning to eat that's the sin offering. That's the part that priests eat of a sin offering, and the Kohanim were planning to eat that beyond the time allowable for eating the portions of a sin offering that are eaten by Kohanim. If they had the right intention at the time of slaughter, they brought the offering, then some of that meat was left over beyond the time when it's permitted to eat it. That's called nosar. But if you at the outset planned to eat this meat during a period that would be nosar, but you had that intention from the beginning, that's called pigul. Okay? So one might have thought that similarly for such an offering, one is also not liable to be punished with kares for intentionally partaking of it while tameh. And the third mention teaches us that one is indeed liable. Therefore, there is still no proof that one is liable to bring a sliding scale sin offering for unwittingly entering the temple while tameh. I'm almost done. Questions or comments? Please get them in now. So rather, the sages of Nehardea say in the name of Rava that it can be derived from the following. Why does the Torah mention 3 times the ritually impure status with regard to one who partakes of peace offerings while tameh? That is, each of the 3 times that the Torah mentions the punishment of kares, it also mentions the fact that the person was tameh at the time. One time is for the general case of a tameh person who eats any kind of offering. One time is for the specific instance of one who partakes of a peace offering. And the third time is to apply it to another case of defiling something sacred that is written in the Torah without specifying what it is referring to. And I do not know from the passage what the case is. And now the only passage that describes the defiling of something sacred without specifying the situation is the passage in the Torah that discusses the sliding scale sin offering that is brought for the defiling of sacrificial foods. Therefore, you must say that the third mention of kares is referring to the defiling of sacrificial foods. But if it is not needed to teach the matter of defiling sacrificial foods because we already derived that through the verbal analogy of Rebbe, apply it to the matter of defiling the temple. And the Gemara asks, but that third mention is also necessary because since it is necessary for the Torah to write the kares punishment 3 times in order to expound it in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Bahu, it also has to write that the person was ritually, was tameh, as it is not sufficient to mention the punishment without mentioning for what the punishment is given. And accordingly, there is still no proof that one is liable to bring a sliding scale sin offering for unwittingly defiling the temple. And we'll be searching for that proof tomorrow at the regular Friday time of noon Pacific. I believe there's only one comment or question. Sharon says, so why then is the term in Yiddish for a wild animal a wilde chaya? Well, that's right? Because we said undomesticated is chaya, domesticated is behema. You're saying why repeat wilde along with chaya? Because why not? Anywhere where Yiddish can be colorful and really Yiddish would be a great language to teach the marks of tzaraas because it's just so nuanced and inflective and descriptive. And I feel like I wish I spoke Yiddish, but just from the few phrases that I've been, shown how they work and how they operate, it just instantly conjures up images in the mind. I wish I spoke Yiddish. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday, regular time, noon Pacific. May everyone have a sweet and uplifting and joy-drenched Lag BaOmer starting tonight.